Spotlight, Argo, American Hustle, The Hunger Games. This is a very small sampling of great films, Oscar-worthy films, that you might never have seen were it not for the Blacklist. Not to be confused with the Hollywood blacklist that came to pass in the 40s and 50s during the McCarthy hearings, banning members of the film industry from working because of alleged communist ties. Today's blacklist is one that people are scrambling to be on. In fact, having your name, or more accurately your script, on this list could open doors that lead to Hollywood greatness. So if you are an aspiring screenwriter with a killer script swimming around in your head, listen up. Today we'll hear from Professor Henry McGee about his case entitled The Blacklist. I'm your host, Brian Kenny, and you're listening to Cold Call.
So we are all sitting there in the classroom.
The professor walks in
and they look up and you know it's coming. Oh, the dreaded cold call.
Henry McGee teaches MBA students and executives at Harvard Business School, and he's also a member of the school's digital initiative. Prior to joining the faculty here, he served as president of HBO Home Entertainment. Henry, thanks for joining us today.
Brian, it's terrific to be here, and it's especially great to be here just a few days before this year's Oscar show.
Yeah. You want to give any picks? No, I don't want you to give anything away.
I'll hold off on that.
All right, great. I loved this case. I love movies, so for me this was really fun to read about something that I never knew existed, and I think most of our listeners won't either, and to hear how it sort of came about and the influence that it's having in Hollywood. Maybe we can start by, can you just set up the case for us? Who's the protagonist and what's on his mind?
Great. Brian, Franklin Leonard is a young entrepreneur who's developed a highly effective method of identifying potential hit screenplays, a sort of holy grail that has eluded the motion picture industry for over a century. He uses crowdsourcing to develop his annual list of hot but unproduced screenplays. This year, in fact, 3 of his films that have been previously identified on the Blacklist, Hell or High Water, Manchester by the Sea, and Arrival, are all nominated for this year's Best Picture Oscar.
That's amazing.
When the case opens, we find Leonard, who has branched into the business of connecting screenwriters and agents and executives through an online service he's developed called the Blacklist.com, now has to ponder what his next move is going to be in Hollywood. And he has to decide whether he's going to leverage the expertise and access that he has into actually go into the business of funding film production.
Yeah, and I'll mention also this case is one of a series of cases that we're doing in the month of February to recognize Black History Month. Franklin is an African-American. He's also a graduate of Harvard Business School, I believe.
Harvard College.
Harvard College,
right.
Yeah. So he's the protagonist in this
Yes.
case. But why did you choose to write about the Blacklist?
Right. This case was originally written to be taught in a new course I launched this fall called Hollywood Distribution and Marketing Challenges in a Digital World. It's a course that combines traditional case method teaching on campus with a structured, hands-on field learning experience for students.
Okay.
The class is about 30 students, and it's broken into small teams that are assigned to address a challenge or an opportunity faced by either a traditional Hollywood player or a disruptor. So our learning partners range from Amazon to Warner Brothers. The students work with a partner remotely during the fall, and then we all moved to L.A. for a couple of weeks at the beginning of January when the students are embedded with the companies and finish their work and recommendations to the companies. More than half the class, as it turns out, has little or no knowledge about the motion picture industry, but they are fascinated both by the economic and cultural power.
Yeah.
When you think about it, on Monday morning, every news outlet prints or talks about 2 statistics, either how the sports team did or what the box office was.
Right.
There's no other industry like that at all. So it's hugely important. And as a result, the cases that I do in the course have to simultaneously do 2 things. They have to introduce the students to the vocabulary of Hollywood, because many of them are unfamiliar,
right.
And at the same time, present them with a challenge that someone in the business is facing. And Franklin Leonard, who is trying to disrupt this business, is absolutely the perfect subject for the students to study because they have to understand the ecosystem that he's playing in and also appreciate the dilemma he faces as he tries to disrupt a system that's pretty entrenched.
I'm going to guess the class is pretty popular. That sounds like
It has been, right.
That would have a lot of takers.
Right.
You spent your career in this industry. It's a very complicated landscape now, and it's become more complicated with the advent of digital streaming and broadband, now getting to the point where people can stream stuff online. How big is the motion picture industry?
The U.S. motion picture industry is roughly about a $45 billion business. That will go up or down depending on the box office for the year. But if you think of it as roughly something between $40 and $50 billion, with about half of that revenue, actually more than half of that revenue, coming from overseas. Interestingly, while there's this fixation on box office grosses, the studios only count on the box office for somewhere between 20 and 30% of the revenue. Domestically, the rest comes from home entertainment, television, and licensing. If you look at the home entertainment business, and there are different definitions, but I'm going to throw in there both DVD, pay-per-view, and digital. That accounts for about a third. TV, including pay TV, about a quarter, and licensing, which is particularly important for a number of studios, is about 10%.
One of the things that I love the way you broke down the way a film gets made. There's a pretty distinctive process here. Can you talk about the sort of 4 components there?
Yes, Brian, Hollywood is traditionally called a dream factory.
Yeah.
And in fact, there are really 4 structural phases that each film goes through: development, financing, production, and distribution. And let me sort of take a deeper dive into what each of those means. In development is when covers everything from the initial idea of the film, the plot, the setting. That can either come from a book, an original idea by a screenwriter, an executive, sort of. Those ideas come from many, many places. In this development period, the screenplay is worked on. The screenplay is used by producers who you might sort of think of as orchestra conductors who are putting together the different pieces to attract a director, stars, and so on. And this package is put together and is ready for financing, which is the second phase of this factory. You have to make a decision. People look at it from studios to independent financiers. Movies are put together even using lines of credit on credit cards, many different ways of doing that. With the money secured, the film then goes into production, which consists of really 2 subphases. One is principal photography, which is people familiar from seeing films about being on set or in a studio.
Yeah.
And then importantly, very importantly these days, what's called post-production, which we add special effects and the music and so on. And then the final phase, the phase which my course is mainly focused on, is the marketing of the film and its distribution. So those are the 4 phases, and that can take anywhere from as little as 2 years to as long as 20, depending on what the film is.
So where does the lonely screenwriter fit into this whole equation? Because that's kind of at the core of what Franklin is doing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, screenwriters are key, although interestingly in Hollywood, the director and stars are typically paid much more than the screenwriter.
The way, isn't it? Yeah.
Although Hollywood has always said that good writing is important, and it really is. And as you know, a number of our greatest American novelists, F. Scott Fitzgerald and others, have gone to try their hand at translating great literature into great films. But one of the things that, in addition to his crowdsourcing that Franklin has done, he's done an important analysis which has guided him and which is making him think about how he should approach filmmaking. And what he decided to do was, rather than focus on the big Hollywood blockbusters, the films that are costing $150 million, $200 million, he says, why don't I take a look at sort of the subset of films I'm interested in seeing, which are typically films $50 or $60 million budget and under. I know it sounds enormous, but by Hollywood, that's not so large. And what he discovered, Brian, in his analysis was that, in fact, if you looked at which films in that 60 and below category had the best financial returns, it wasn't those films that had gotten major acting awards. It wasn't those films who had gotten major directorial awards. It was the screenplay award that most determined their financial success.
Yeah, very interesting. One of the things that the case gets into is the kind of pressure that the industry is under, and what maybe drives the industry to choose these blockbuster, or tentpole is another expression that you use in the case, these $150 to $200 million films, while they're leaving, to the side some films that could have great potential. How do they balance that pressure?
Well, the studios in the entire ecosystem, what has happened is that the studios have increasingly focused on the large blockbusters because, by the way, that's where the money is.
Yeah.
It's important to remember, if you look at, for example, this last year's box office, 2016, of the top 5 films, 4 of them were released by Disney.
Yeah.
And the 5th was Universal. All of these were big blockbuster films, budgets well in excess of $150 million. We've talked about the importance of the global market. These are films that travel well. And these are also studios with huge amounts of overhead and worldwide distribution apparatus. And they can't really, a smaller film isn't really worth their time. So as a result, you do have a number of independent distributors who are fitting in that niche. I do want to say, though, again, that there are almost 2 different industries. So, for example, again, just looking at last year, the number 1 film was Rogue One, the Star Wars film from Disney, which had a U.S. box office gross of well over $500 million. The largest independent film last year, and still in theaters, I'm excluding the films from the 6 majors and the mini majors. We'll come back and talk about that in a minute. But if you look at purely independent films, the number 1 film was Manchester by the Sea, and that has yet, after all these many weeks, yet to get to $50 million at the box office. So you can see you're playing in 2 very different fields.
And I would imagine a film like Manchester by the Sea probably wouldn't have the international appeal, obviously, that a blockbuster film would have.
It's not unusual for a American action film to actually have a bigger gross outside the U.S. than inside the U.S.
People like action.
The premise of the course is 2, and we talk about the challenges facing the business. There are 2 things that are driving them. One is globalization, and the second is digitalization, both of which have changed everything we know about the business. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about globalization. It's important for people to understand that after years of being the number 1 market for theatrical films, that sometime within the next 2 or 3 years, maybe even sooner, China will actually have a bigger box office than the U.S. So there's tremendous focus on the growth of the business outside of the United States and a real premium on developing both the product and the distribution mechanisms that can capitalize on this growth of overseas market. The industry is still dealing with the impact of digitalization and what that means in terms of both how films are produced and how they are distributed. And now that we have moved to the fact that a film can easily be zipped around on the internet to legally or otherwise, right? To homes all around the globe, Hollywood finds that it now has some very, very serious competition from Silicon Valley. And so while the game has generally been one of the 6 majors playing with one another and arguing about shares, it's a new ball game with the entrance of companies like Amazon and Netflix. It's worth pointing out, for example, that Manchester by the Sea, which is nominated for 6 Oscars, is a film from Amazon, for example. Another big development is it's very likely that Time Warner will soon become a wholly owned subsidiary of the AT&T Corporation. It's a very fast-changing and dramatically changing industry, and that's the one in which Franklin is trying to figure out what the role of an independent can be in there.
Tell me a little bit about Franklin. What's he like? What motivates him?
Franklin is a great guy. He's always been interested in literature and in, is his term, not mine, a numbers geek. He graduated from Harvard College, wasn't quite sure what he was going to do, so he spent a little time working on a political campaign. He spent some time working as a reporter for a newspaper in the Caribbean, and as is often the case for many Harvard College graduates, he found himself as an analyst at McKinsey and got a call from a friend in Hollywood that there was an opening as an assistant at the very powerful agency CAA, Creative Artists Agency. And even though it involved initially answering the phone and getting coffee, Franklin realized that that was a way to get into the business. So he packed up everything and moved from the East Coast to California and has been there ever since.
Yeah. And it sounded in the case like he was pretty much aware of his own personal brand and how he presented himself was going to have an impact on how people received the Blacklist in his business. He's in this California setting. He's kind of playing that Hollywood part, but he's also very astute about the numbers and the strategy that he's chosen as he thinks about evolving what he started.
Right. Now, Franklin is very much his own man. He is aware that as an African American working in what has traditionally been a largely white industry, people often look at him curiously, but he is self-confident enough that he proudly wears his braids, and his brilliance come across immediately.
And the sort of
he's also very affable. People like working with him.
Yeah, I'm sure. And there's a sort of wry humor behind the name The Blacklist.
Yes. Now, The Blacklist is a play on a couple of things. Earlier in the program, you mentioned the blacklist from the 50s, which was a negative thing.
Yeah.
You obviously didn't want to be on the blacklist because you couldn't get work in Hollywood. Also, Franklin was aware that often the term black in the English language is used for something negative. And so as a black man working in Hollywood, he was desperate to reclaim blackness as a positive. And so by calling it the blacklist that you actually wanted to be on as to not be on, he totally subverted that. So it's the first time in Hollywood where you really want to be on the blacklist.
I love that.
And it's also an interesting time for him as he thinks about these projects to be in Hollywood where the focus, where there's action on it, we can talk about it or not, but the focus is on diversity. As you know, last year we had the Oscars So White campaign. For the last 2 years in a row, not a single actor of color had been nominated for an acting award. The Motion Picture Academy, which gives out the Oscars under Cheryl Boone Isaacs, who happens to be an African-American woman, decided to dramatically open up the ranks of Oscar voters. And in fact, this year, so going from 0 nominees in the acting category for 2 years running, this year we have 6 actors of color, 4 of whom are African Americans, which is obviously a great thing to happen during Black History Month.
Yeah, and I'm sure Franklin is paying close attention to that too, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So for the aspiring screenplay writer that I shouted out to in the intro, what would they expect to happen if they submitted a screenplay to the Blacklist?
They get 2 things. One, they get feedback about the writing, the quality of the writing, and it's scored along different dimensions. And so that it's sort of a mentoring, tutoring goes on. But importantly, what happens is it gets a grade, and it's a way for studio executives and agents also have access to the screenplay because it's posted. One of my students described it as sort of a Yelp for screenplays.
Right.
Yeah.
And sort of careful what you look for because I'm sure the feedback is not always what people are expecting it to be. Have you taught this in class?
I have, and the students love it. We were also fortunate enough that Franklin came out from California to be in the class, and they loved him. I think what the students like are 2 things. One is it gives them a sense of the business and its complexity, and at the same time gives them hope that there is room for innovation and for a young person to come in with new ideas. I mean, after all, the Blacklist, which is relatively new, actually started in 2005 when Franklin was working as a low-level production executive at a company and couldn't believe that he couldn't find anything good he wanted to read. So what he decided to do was to send out a letter to about 75 of his contacts and ask them to put together a list of their favorite screenplays they had read that year, but that had not yet been produced. And what he would do would be compile that and then send it back. This was, by the way, in the era of faxes, so to show you how far back it goes. And it immediately caught on as a sort of crowdsourcing approach to finding out what the best screenplays that were out there. It wasn't too long before Hollywood embraced this. So, for example, Franklin told me that he knew that the Blacklist was making an impact when he was a production executive. All this had been done anonymously. He was a production executive, and an agent came to him and said, "Franklin, I really shouldn't be telling you this, but I have inside news that the screenplay I'm showing you, it's going to be on next year's Blacklist."
That's great. That's great. That's definitely validation that he probably welcomed. Just going back to the students and how they think about this in class, did Franklin walk away with any great ideas for different directions that he could take it in?
No, I think his focus right now is his dilemma is trying to figure out where in the chain he wants to be. So we go back, we talked about the four components of the film business, which are pre-production, financing, production, and distribution. He's been very much embedded in that whole pre-production area, identifying hit screenplays and giving notes and so on.
Yeah.
He has an opportunity because people have approached him because of his database and his taste to expand that and get involved in film financing. The question is, can he really stop there? And once you've put your money into a project or other investors' money, given the importance of distribution and marketing, does he also have to get involved there? And so where in that manufacturing and distribution chain does he enter? And he's still wrestling with that.
Yeah, that could be a B case.
A B case, very much so.
That's
it.
Henry, thank you so much for joining us today.
My great pleasure. It's really been fun.
You can find the Blacklist case along with thousands of others in the HBS case collection at hbr.org. I'm your host, Brian Kenny, and you've been listening to Cold Call, the official podcast of Harvard Business School.